Good day, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. This is Zhang Weiwei, Director of the China Institute, Fudan University. So this will be our first session of the Thinkers Forum. So today we will be discussing this very important topic of how China's common prosperity may change the world. China is now waging a common prosperity campaign, pledging to adjust its redistribution system and have affluence more fairly shared by everyone. While some endorse China's push for greater equality, others see it as a cover for crackdown on billionaires or even dissidents. In today's discussions, we want to examine China's intention, its domestic environment, and this policy's impact or possible impact on the world. Is China the only country facing the pressing issue of inequality? Surely not. In the United States, the top 1% have a combined net worth of $34.2 trillion, while the bottom 50% of the population holds just $2.1 trillion combined. So today we also want to examine the driving forces that have been reproducing inequality in human societies. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests for today. Joining us today are Dr. Nazrul Islam. He is Minister and Deputy Chief of Mission for the Bangladesh Embassy in China. He will help us further understand the growth path of former European colonies and developing countries. We are also honored to have Mr. Charles Liu joining us in this discussion. And Charles is the co-founder of How Capital, has formerly served in the UN Economic and Social Council for 15 years. From him, we'll be hearing the business side of the story on inequality and China's common prosperity policy. Our third guest will be Dr. Christophe Kutarna. Dr. Christophe Kutarna is an international best-selling author of Age of Discovery, a fellow of Oxford Business School. Chris is running a new initiative called Most Valued Questions, a global media and learning community. He has invited audience from the business communities, from investment communities across Europe and North America to join our discussion. At the end of our discussion, Chris will join us with his views and questions from the audience. So, without much ado, let's invite Mr. Nazrul Islam, our Bangladesh friend. You have the floor.
Tachia How. Thank you so much, Professor Zhang Weiwei. You are the person whose writings has inspired me to come to China and has imbued my heart and mind to know more about China. And I am really honored that I am joining this first forum of the Thinkers Forum. So today's topic is how China's common prosperity may impact the world. It's a very vital, very important question. Definitely this China's policy of common prosperity will have great impact, especially at the current moment, because China is a leading country in the world now. So I think it is a very vital question at this moment. So the common prosperity, it is not a new idea in China. Since the establishment of People's Republic, it always existed. In 1953, an article was published in People's Daily articulating the principle of common prosperity. At that time, it was like that the land and resources and equipment were common property of the people. But during the time of the paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, he changed it a little bit. He allowed some people to become richer first, some regions to become richer first, and that bring lot of prosperity for Chinese people and different regions, especially the coastal regions of China, and has increased the inequality among the people and among the regions of China. But it also continued later on during the time of President Jiang Zemin. He actually presented 3 represents, and at that time he allowed the private companies and also the private property, private entrepreneurs, he legitimized in the Communist Party system. And during the time of President Ho Jintao, common prosperity was a slogan among other 2 major slogans like harmonious society and scientific development. But I think at this moment, when China is leading the world under the watch of President Xi Jinping, it is more vital. It will have a long lasting implication, more significant implication for the world, especially for the developing countries. President Xi Jinping last year has declared this, has pronounced this common prosperity in a new angle. At this moment, when China is leading the Belt and Road Initiative under the President Xi Jinping time, this common prosperity has a different meaning. China really mean it now to minimize the gap between the regions and among the people. When Deng Xiaoping initiated the process of allowing some people become richer, the coastal region of China became richer first. The industrialization was in the coastal region, and that created the inequality. The western part and the northern part of China was left behind. Because of they are very close to the sea, they could trade. The industrialization was faster at that time. But with the Belt and Road Initiative and the fast transportation system and opening of the western part of the China, connecting the central region with the European countries and other parts through Belt and Road, other parts of the country is connecting with the industrialization. That will minimize the gap among the regions and also the people. And actually I would like to interpret it in the light of historical perspective of generating the resources. Like if you look back to the history, people of the world was in the similar condition of their income before the industrial revolution started. In 750, the first industrial revolution started with the invention of steam engine. That created the first huge income gap among the countries with steam engine. And in 1850s, the second industrial revolution started with the invention of electricity. And the third one was in 1950s after the Second World War with the electronics coming up in the industrial revolution. So if you see all these 3 industrial revolution, the countries which are leading this industrial revolution, they are actually shaping the global public commons and the prosperity of the countries, of the peoples. And now we are in the 4th industrial revolution, and I am very happy to say here that this 4th industrial revolution, China is actually leading so far. 4th industrial revolution has 2 components. First is 5G technology, which will revolutionize the production of industries and the connection of the people and their engagement in economic activities. And China is leading 5G technology because 40% of the global 5G technology is under the Chinese companies and Chinese technology industries at this moment. And the second component of this 4th industrial revolution is the green growth. Because of the compulsion of the Paris Agreement, every country has to generate energy from the green sources, and China is leading the world again in terms of solar, wind, water, all the green sources of energy. China is leading the whole world. 40% of global green energy is coming from China alone, and China has the technological edge in all these sectors. So China is very much poised to lead the world in the 4th industrial revolution. And that is also a great opportunity to be an equalizer. Like technology is a great equalizer. I have visited like 17 provinces in China and more than 50 countries around the world. In China, I have seen the people who are living under the poverty line, they are catching up with by using this technology. So, technology is a great equalizer, and the second is also a great opportunity for China, like the eastern part developed faster, but now the provinces like which are more desert and mountainous like Xinjiang or Tibet, they can use their land to produce green energy. That will generate more resources for them to equalize those states with other part of China. So, China is very much poised, and it is the right moment to minimize the gap in inequality in China. So, let us now look at how it will impact the other parts of the world, especially the developing countries like Bangladesh. So, I am very much hopeful, I am very much encouraged to see the developments in China, but there is some difficulties for the developing countries like for example Bangladesh. Bangladesh, you will be maybe some of you will be surprised to know that Bangladesh has progressed a lot since 1971 when we got independence. Now Bangladesh is the fastest growing economy in the Asia Pacific. IMF has published a report that Bangladesh is the one of the 3 fastest growing economy in the world, and Bangladesh economy is growing really very fast, more than 8% GDP. Our per capita income has surpassed the other South Asian countries now. China is contributing the most in terms of investment, in terms of technology, in terms of a loan, in every aspect. China has been contributing because we are an initial country of the Belt and Road, and we are also not very far. But there is some problem for countries like Bangladesh. It is not from the part of China, but due to the global dictate of the green growth. Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated country in the world. It is a small country if you compare Bangladesh with China, but we have 170 million people. It is very fertile land, but very densely populated. We do not have the space to generate solar energy, wind energy, or we do not have the waterfall or mountains to produce electricity from hydropower. So, we have the only option of producing electricity from fossil fuel, and now with this the dictate of the Paris Agreement to produce energy from green sources, it is going to be difficult. Bangladesh government has 10 years back made a too clear vision to make the country a middle income country by 2021, which we have achieved this last year. 2021 we have become middle income country, and the government has also has a vision to become a developed country by 2041, and we are currently on the right track to become a developed country by 2041. And for this we need production of energy, electricity. At this moment our production is 25,000 megawatt, but we need it to make it 60,000 megawatt by 2041. So, how we will generate this electricity for our growth? That is a $1 million question now, and also the China has declared that China will not only stop producing energy from coal within country, but also would not fund outside China. So, just 3 months back Bangladesh government has scrapped production of electricity from coal from 10 projects, which by cutting 10,000 megawatt of electricity. So, that is how we are falling in some kind of difficulties at this moment. So, I think that the principle of common prosperity is definitely will be helping China to minimize the equality gap within China. But for the countries like Bangladesh, we have some external problems, external dictates which are hindering our development. And another thing I want to point out here, that for the climate change we have not contributed at all historically. Our population is 2.2% in the world, and our emission is only 0.22%, that is 10 times less than the global average. If you consider the per capita emission, is our emission per capita is 0.47 ton per capita. In case of United States is more than 15 ton, and in case of European country it is more than 9 ton. In case of Japan more than 9 ton. In case of China it is around 7 ton now. So, our production, the emission is still very low, but still we are being dictated by this green growth not to use the fossil fuel, and which will be hindering our development. So, I think that the common prosperity which was really helping under the Belt and Road Initiative, and it is also an example how the Belt and Road Initiative was helping for the growth of the developing countries like Bangladesh, and which has now the prospect of slowing down because of these external dictates. So, that is what I wanted to say from the perspective of developing countries and also my understanding about China. Thank you so much, Professor. I would be listening from other colleagues and others, and I will be answering the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nazrul Islam, and thank you very much for your kind words to me. And I'm impressed by your knowledge of China and the evolution of China's common prosperity policy. And I think you have the insight concerning this fourth industrial revolution and the chance for China to grasp it both as a way for common prosperity and also ways and means to overcome challenges posed by common prosperity. And also, I'm glad that you mentioned the difficulties and challenges faced by a developing country like Bangladesh. So thank you very much. Now, I give the floor to Mr. Charles Liu. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. Good to see you again. Common prosperity. The way I remember it in China, at the founding of the People's Republic, it was common poverty. It's a miracle that China has achieved the growth and the wealth creation that has occurred over the last half a century. It's just never happened in human history. Something like that has occurred. But it can occur. It can also lead to serious problems which extremes of capital can create. Like what we see in the United States. It's no longer a question of inequality. It is just as clearly unfairness. I would not look at common prosperity as a drive to create equality, because there will never be equality in the absolute sense. What we should seek is fairness. Now, what we see in China today is there's been creation of so much value and wealth that the disparity or the unfairness of it all is beginning to creep up. And much of this is based on how the market economy as defined by the West operates. The market economy, even in the turn of the 20th century, I think, 19th to the 20th century, the US had to have the Sherman Act to break up the monopolies which existed. Standard Oil of New Jersey, AT&T, they were all broken up because what does monopoly do? It creates inefficiencies and it extracts value from the consumer. And it's really, really unfair. So even the US had to face that issue. But the last 20 years, of course, capital has run rampant and has become such a dominating force to the point where in the US you have the numbers which were cited by Professor Zhang of top 1% is so much more than the bottom 50% or 60%. So China has to address this before it occurs. Watch out for oligopolies and monopolies. Watch out for inefficiencies which a dominance of capital in the market economy can lead to. And this, I think, is how China is addressing the common prosperity issue. What is also very significant is the government issue. What we're doing with common prosperity is preparing for the next phase of China's growth and development. When the government takes its job seriously, it it intends to improve society as a whole, to create fairness instead of being beholden to vested interests. It's very dangerous if China went down the route of the Western market forces driven economies. I think this is what the Chinese government has demonstrated it is watching out for and is being very, very careful about. And it's, I think, critical for continued development of China. Now, when you have a government that thinks about the overall well-being of society, then you plan and execute and strategize accordingly. We look at, for example, the United States today. Anything coming out of the Republicans, the Democrats will hate it. Anything out of the Democrats, the Republicans will hate it. Taking off the tariff war, tariffs against China, will immediately help in reducing inflation, which has reached historic highs. No, they don't do it because they do politics. That's a government which is not looking at the overall well-being of society as a whole, but small package of vested interest. There are some philosophical issues here. It's because I think most Western government is based philosophically on individuals, while 3,000 years of Chinese history is based on betterment of societies, starting with family, but going into societies. I think what we should do in terms of common prosperity in the Chinese context is not impose this on our friends from Bangladesh or anybody else, but I think sharing this experience of what we have done in China, the stage of development we've reached, and hence what we should plan for in the future, that type of experience I think can be very valuable for other developing countries. There are developing countries which are today still at common poverty level, and it will take some time for them to reach the level where there would be a sufficient accumulation of wealth to be able to better their entire livelihood. So they have to go through some of these phases. But China is at a specific phase, and I think the Chinese experience and the Chinese government execution of betterment of society as a whole is something that is really worthwhile for a lot of developing countries, not to emulate, but to take as an example and work with. Thank you.
So thank you, Charles, for your insightful, informative, and even philosophical remarks. And thank you very much. So could you say a few words on how to reform these global financial institutions or institutions of development like World Bank, IMF, so that they can also contribute to common prosperity worldwide?
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, the World Bank, IMF, these institutions were created after the Second World War. Professor, you know, the institutions created at that time were under the hegemony of a country, and the principles were also dominated in that sense, the capitalism. And it is really unfortunate and that hardly any country, and you wrote in this book, China Web, that looking around the world, you don't see any country has developed from underdevelopment with these policies. So I think we need a new kind of financial mechanism. New development bank has been recently established in Shanghai, and I have some articles on Green Climate Fund. Actually, you know that we need a new kind of financial mechanism to help the developing countries to develop, especially under the dictate of this green growth. Because you know, if we are obliged to produce energy from the green sources, the gap between the fossil fuel and green energy, it is huge. So why should a country like Bangladesh, which has no contribution so far in climate change, has to pay this, and which is really underdeveloped? So the gap, at least we don't want any aid, we want to minimize the gap. So if the gap, like if it is $1 for fossil fuel and $3 for green fuel. So this the gap of $2 has to be compensated. This is justice. This is called justice. Has to be compensated by a financial mechanism. So the Green Climate Fund has been established in 2013, but that is not also helping in that way. That is basically facilitating mitigation. So I think that the global aviation industry and other industries which are emitting carbon dioxide gas, that has to be taxed, and the tax generated from that has to be compensated for the countries like Bangladesh. That kind of principle needs to be initiated so that the countries like underdeveloped countries can really catch up in the development stride. Otherwise, these policies will only hinder the development of the countries. We will say that we are making the principle to help you to develop, ultimately it does not help, actually it hinders, it goes opposite. So a financial mechanism needs to be developed to minimize this gap of the cost of production of energy. That is what I believe, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. As we read in the Western media, there is a lot of coverage concerning this, common prosperity, but it's portrayed as a kind of suppression against tech giants and compel them to make contributions to so-called common prosperity. The story of Alibaba and Tencent, etc., described in a negative way. What's your take, your comment on that kind of accusation?
I think this comes directly to the question of monopolies, because Alibaba was adopting a number of measures forcing companies to choose between Alibaba and others. If you sold things on Alibaba, you're not allowed to sell elsewhere. This is creation of monopolies, which creates inefficiencies and it imposes a higher cost on the consumer. And these are precisely the things which I think will be very damaging to common prosperity in the long term. And the second part is, we don't want to be in a situation like in America 20 years from now, whereby 55,000 homeless live on the streets, while 100 people have enough money to burn for 100 generations, not 10 generations, 100, 200 generations. Is that a society we want to be proud of? No, we don't want that type of society to occur. And the rampant march of capital is so dangerous for a country like China that I think it has to be controlled and restricted. But this is not stopping investors coming into China, because on a global basis, I think the Chinese growth and the management of the economy, the governance is far beyond or superior to any other developed country or any other country, period. And the yield and the return on investment continues to be, on a relative basis, much better than others. And the management of the pandemic has also been far superior. So in terms of overall governance, investors, I don't think investors are holding back at all. I see investors actually coming in, including a lot of my co-investors on projects.
Thank you for this very important answer. But there is another accusation, which is again portraying China's policy for common prosperity as a kind of deliberate strategy to decouple with the United States, to have a kind of Chinese powerful manufacturing sectors decoupled from United States in the name of common prosperity, in the name of this so-called internal circulation. Do you see this kind of accusation reasonable or fallacy, whatever?
I have to say, who started the whole decoupling process? It was Donald Trump and the trade war, decoupling from China. This is typical hypocrisy from Western press. They started something, they wanted to decouple from China, and discovered they cannot decouple from China, and discovered that the whole manufacturing basis in the US has become such that they're dependent more on China than anything else. Now, So now China is being accused of wanting to decouple from the West. I don't think that will happen. China is the major trading partner of over 120 countries, and that includes many countries in Europe, the entire EU for that matter, and all of Southeast Asia. What we have in Asia is, I think, a very interesting thing. The shift from the West to the East is not the shift from West to China, it's to Asia overall. It's a modern supply chain that is so sophisticated and is the best in human history. And that is Asia with China at its core. And that is very pragmatic and very realistic. There's no disengagement. Disengagement from China cannot be, because look at our CEP that was just implemented, which I think will be very substantial. And I try to suggest to my friends in Europe, EU should join our CEP.
The final question for Mr. Islam. As you are experienced diplomat, you have been to over 50 countries, and most of the developing countries. So what's your impression of the issue of inequality in addition to your country, Bangladesh, or about other countries? Is this a very serious issue?
Thank you, Professor. Actually, I have served in Europe and Middle East, and I have traveled around the world. In Europe, I feel that there is a redistribution system. In the name of social service, there is guarantee of minimum income. If somebody does not have a job, they get some money from the social security system. So that's how the inequality in Europe is more tolerable. It is like the Gini coefficient is like 0.31 to 0.35, which is very much tolerable. And it is similar to my country. Bangladesh is leading in terms of equality, the South Asia, and also the women empowerment social system is the most progressive in South Asia. In Middle East, some countries are like Saudi Arabia, the inequality is very high because of some people have a lot of resources from the fossil fuel, but in general people have the income source. And for America, inequality is high, but still they have opportunity. The country is as big as China, a little bit maybe similar size, but the population is less. So the people have the opportunity of getting employment. But China has really, although the inequality is very high in China, but China has done a spectacular job. More than 80 million people bringing up from the poverty line. Everybody has minimum source of income. This is not a matter of joke. China did not occupy other country, did not grab the proper resources from other country. It did by itself. And it is an inspiration for the countries, developing countries like Bangladesh or other countries. That's why I came to China to learn from China. And the stable government and certainty, these are the things. And there is a lot of things to learn from China, how China brought the people. And now it is the proper moment to minimize the gap between the very rich and rich region and the less rich region. And also there is opportunity, like this high-speed train. China has the largest 60,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in China. This is the largest in the whole world. So in that way, the industry will be spread in the villages. That's how the gap between the villages, between the township and the other regions will be minimized. And also this green growth. So all these things, it's another historic moment for China and right policy. China has almost always followed the right policy. That's how the country has become so developed now. Okay, I have traveled 53 countries. I can compare China with any developed countries, like in terms of infrastructure. So all these things, China has come up from the level of Bangladesh when it was very poor in 1971, and now this level of development, it's really spectacular. So although the inequality is very high, but there is no people below the absolute poverty line. So that is, it is also very inspiring for us. We are learning from China. Thank you, Professor.
Dario, who is also a venture capitalist and well known in the Chinese society as well, because he made a lot of comments on China and United States. Recently, he said the United States should also embrace common prosperity. What's your take on that kind of suggestion or proposal?
Ray has been a close follower of China since his first visit. I think it was about 34, 35 years ago. And Bridgewater has always been positive about China's economic growth. I think what he said about how the U.S. should take a bite or take a learning from China's common prosperity is referring exactly to what I was talking about before, because he talked about also, why should there be so much poverty in America when you have so much wealth? Why should there be, even though the elite universities are in America, but the second tier, third tier education system is really poor? Why shouldn't United States try to improve yourself in re-educating workers when the society's economic basis changed? Why can't the US government do some of these things that the Chinese government is doing to improve society as a whole? I think that was on the Bloomberg interview, and it was spectacular, but he was attacked by many because of it. I think one of the things we should look at is US politicians are spewing basically garbage about China. It's all vilification. US politicians and the ignorant and the Western media are vilifying China. But Wall Street, especially the more sophisticated ones on Wall Street, are certainly taking a different view on China. And they're continuing to follow China's and the investment opportunities closely. And Ray Dalio is one of them. But look at who else? Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase. And all the other major banks. HSBC just bought out their partner in the brokerage firm to be wholly owned in China. All of them are actively continuing to pursue the Chinese market.
Thank you, both of you. And now let's go to London. And we're going to have Christophe Kutarna from London, from your office, your home. I hope you will speak a few words, and then we'll have floor from your audience, whatever. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. So I'm a political scientist. My PhD at Oxford is actually in the politics of China. And so I tend to look at any government act from the position of trying to understand the role of power in society. And so that's the lens with which I look at the common prosperity policy. It is so important to humanity that we're exploring the question of how to get there. I think it's probably true that no large country that has gone through rapid industrialization, and Dr. Islam, as you say, we're in the fourth industrial revolution now. No large country that has figured out how to harness capital, how to harness innovation to create wealth, has also figured out the equitable distribution of that wealth. And so as humanity, as civilization, we're still working on that problem. And that there are very ambitious and different projects underway across the globe working on that problem, I think is a good thing. And so it's a good thing that here we have this massive, successfully developing country, which is China, saying, okay, here's how we're going to try to get there. So that's just some of my preface. In terms of a kind of political analysis of why this policy comes out of Beijing now, it makes a lot of sense from a kind of a political economy point of view. And I guess I'll just briefly make 3 points on that. One, I think it's fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party has a historical sensitivity to public instability. I think it's probably fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party looks at itself as proof of what is possible when a counter narrative becomes strong. And although historians have all sorts of theories and explanations for the revolution in the first half of the 20th century. I would think that one of the main narratives from Beijing's perspective is that the Kuomintang lost the support of most of the people. It started to seem to be out of touch with the concerns and needs of most people, particularly in rural areas, and that created the opportunity space for a new narrative to come up, to gain power, to be persuasive. And on the back of that narrative, on the back of offering to offer a more equitable distribution to everyone, we came to power. So I think that there is this kind of historical sensitivity to instability and social instability within the Chinese Communist Party. And I think this common prosperity policy is in part a response to that. My second point would be, okay, well, if we look at modern China today, having gone through the past 30, 40 years of rapid development, and ask ourselves, where are the signs of instability in society today? There are several divisions that have not yet been solved and that are difficult divisions for China to solve. One remains the urban and the rural divide, very different economic outcomes in urban and rural China. Another remains the coastal interior divide, which really hasn't moved much over the past 30 years. There is, as we look across industry sectors, tech has done fabulously well of late. Other sectors, mama hoo-hoo, right? And economic inequality has really shot up. I don't think that it's a situation where China is looking at where the US is at and saying, we don't want to end up there with that kind of inequality. Statistically, it's more like we're already there. So when President Xi Jinping talks about a goal of an olive-shaped income distribution, it comes from a place where right now it is a kind of a top-heavy pyramid, or at least that's the shape that we've been building over the past 30 years. And I suppose then my third point in terms of a political analysis is that the Chinese Communist Party needs to renew its source of legitimacy. Originally, we were a revolutionary party, and that was our legitimacy. We won the revolution. But the revolution was 70 years ago. And so, now it's about delivering the goods. We know that economic growth is slowing down. So it's going to be difficult to deliver the goods if what that means is just constant, rapid economic growth. If I live in Beijing and Shanghai right now, if I am a supremely educated young professional, like working at a major consultancy, unless my parents have wealth, I probably can't afford to buy a home in Beijing and Shanghai. So when even the new economic elites can't buy a house, it's going to be difficult to continue to sell the story of everybody's going to get wealthy. And so we need to renew, some of the sources of legitimacy that we had access to in the past. And I think you see that in the language of President Xi Jinping saying that, some of the narratives, some of the legitimacy that we talked a lot about in the Mao era around egalitarianism, that's still part of what's important to us. And if we can put that narrative forth and kind of shift people's expectations from we're all going to get rich to let's build maybe not an egalitarian society, but a more equitable society, then that's what's going to earn the right to rule for the next 50 years or the next 70 years. So that's how I come at this policy. And it makes very clear sense to me how, given the historical sensitivities of the Communist Party, given the many instabilities that remain and have not yet been solved in Chinese society, and in some ways have been made more difficult through the past 30 years of rapid development, and given the need to renew the legitimacy of governing, that a policy like this comes forth and we're like, yeah, we think that this is going to be our vehicle. So maybe what I do in terms of trying to imagine the questions of the audience, and just a very general question that I'll open to all of you is, so none of this has been done yet. This policy is very new. It needs to accomplish a lot. There's not a lot of specificity yet. You know, it's quite vague in terms of what will actually happen as a result of this. And there's no guarantee that it's going to result in that better future that we all want in China. So while we've just spent a lot of time talking, with confidence about what is going to happen, I think we would do a service for our audience to this if we also spent a bit of time talking about our doubts of why might this not work? What's going to get in the way? How is it going to be difficult to achieve some of the aspirations of common prosperity? And again, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and bring some of these questions to this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Could I perhaps take this opportunity to really try to answer a question, a few points raised in your talk? Indeed, if you look at the gaps between rich and poor and between regions, I would say the Chinese case is relative deprivation. In other words, it's indeed a miracle that you have lifted over 700 million people out of abject poverty. We made a calculation. If you look at the government inputs and household assets and all this together, I can see the poorest people in China today is much better than those 500,000 or more homeless in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York in skid rows. Much, much better. Because we made a rough calculation. We go to Yunnan province, the mountain areas, the poorest of poorest county. We have already succeeded in ensuring medical insurance for all, education for all, and housing for all. So this bottom is already there. So what we should, of course, do much better to raise their level to a higher level. And in the West, actually, people use more of this Gini coefficient to analyze Chinese case and other cases, other countries. My own thinking is this is likely a challenge for analyzing a country as large as China. If you look at the Gini coefficient for the whole country, for China, that's rather big. It's 0.747 or something. But still, it's narrowing down a bit. But if you look at the Gini coefficient within Shanghai, within Jiangsu province, or within whatever provinces, in other words, rather than this huge scale of China, a continent, but you look at a rather limited scale, then it's basically all reasonable. But what's more important, you're right in making a point that this sensitivity to social instability. The Chinese have a very strong culture for you call egalitarianism. As Confucius famously said, don't be afraid of poverty, but you cannot have polarization. Indeed, the long-term strategy since Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s, he said would allow some people, some region to come out first, prosperous, and then bring the rest into common prosperity. So that's a strategy for 30, 40, 50 years. Now we're at this stage. And then if you look at the regional differences, I've been to all these interior provinces over the past 5 years. For at least 15 years running, all China's internal and western part of China have developed faster than coastal China. And there is what I call interactive relationship, positive interactions between coastal provinces and the interior provinces. So this is no longer a major concern in China. A major concern is how to overcome and narrow this relative gap as the Chinese cultural tendency towards common prosperity. And then for this idea of common prosperity, maybe you fail to notice a a very interesting project because the government of China, Beijing, has identified the Zhejiang province as a pilot project province for common prosperity. The idea is by the year 2035, which means 14, 15 years from now, China will achieve basically common prosperity for the whole country. But for Zhejiang province, it will be the year 2025, which means 4 years from now. Yeah, because Zhejiang has a better starting point. If you look at the rural urban divide gap, it's roughly close to 2 times. For the whole country, 2.6 times. So the idea is by the year 2025, Zhejiang will basically achieve that. And by year 2035, the whole country will basically achieve that. And usually, as you follow China closely, China is fulfilling its plans better than most other countries if they have any plans. I just make this brief comment.
If I could just add something, Chris. The first point you made, that the Chinese Communist Party, as you said specifically, are concerned about social stability. Name a country in which the government is not concerned about its own social stability. China, concerned about its social stability, is key to allow the country's economy to continue to grow and progress, science and technology to develop. So it's not a conspiratorial theory that China is concerned about social stability. Without social stability, you don't get investments, you don't get progress, you don't get further better improvement of life. So any government will be keen. So I don't think that your first point about the Chinese Communist Party is particularly concerned about this. Actually, I think the Chinese government is less concerned about it than many other countries today, because living in China, we're living in Beijing now for 30 some years. What I've seen is the confidence of the government is far, far beyond that of many other Western or other countries' population in terms of confidence in their government. We've seen how they dealt with the pandemic. We've seen how US president wanted to inject things into his vein and use Clorox to rinse his mouth, to the Chinese that admired the US for so long, for so many years, now all of a sudden have a feel that, gee, our government seems to be more scientific and strategic and does a better job of governance than what we see in America and elsewhere. So I think the confidence of the masses are actually quite high. As many of my foreign friends who live in Beijing and Shanghai have said, this is the place where they feel the most comfortable and absolutely the safest in than walking the streets of New York at midnight. So I think, yes, there is always concern for social stability. Yes, there's always a hope that there would be no polarization in society. But China is probably less concerned about that than many other countries. And the population seems to be more comfortable. Well, Professor Zhang, I think, addressed perfectly, much better than I can, the details of the plan, and in terms of the provinces and what actions are being planned and implemented. But as an investor in China, and have been for a long time, and work with the investment community for the last 3 decades, everything is relative when you look at global portfolio management. And we really, really do see, in terms of China, there is social stability, there is continued room for growth, and there is probably better opportunities for profitability than many other places. Thank you.
And any questions from your audience?
Yeah, well, so loving that we're getting into this discussion now. And one thing I'll just try to emphasize again. So I'm a scientist, right? I'm not an opinion maker. I'm a political scientist, not a politician. I agree with you, Professor Zhang. I mean, a lot of the coverage, just of China in general in any Western media, tends to be accusatory, or looking for the deviousness within everything that Beijing does. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from this with a scientific lens, genuinely curious about how the world works, about the different political projects underway in the world. So please don't feel that points that I'm making are things that need to be defended against. I'm Canadian, not American, if that helps, just to clarify. What would your thoughts be to foreign investors who look upon the common prosperity policy as basically increasing political risk of doing business in China? That, I'm familiar with the ongoing warm relationship of the financial sector within China. I'm also very familiar with the ongoing need that China has for the foreign financial sector. That's a sector where we still very clearly need your participation. And so the day after that we announce our common prosperity policy, we're going to send out Liu He to talk to the financial sector and reassure them that this does not change things for you. So, I'm aware of these dynamics underway, but not everybody who is a foreign investor is going to be in the financial sector. So what about the many other sectors that are looking at what does this policy mean for us? What are some of the thoughts that you have on that question?
Yeah, in fact, the Chinese model of development is quite straightforward. It's a mixed economy where the role of the state and role of the market all play their ideally complementary roles. Sometimes they conflict with each other, but in most cases they are together. And Chris, you mentioned that you are a political scientist. You follow closely this role of the powers. I have a view that to analyze any country, whether China, Canada, United States, or UK, I try to focus on the relations between three powers I call social power, political power, and capital power. And as I'm a defender of the China model for many, many years, I think it's a good model. On the whole, it has its weaknesses, but on the whole, it's a better model than the American model. Again, referring to the United States, I'm sorry, because we are bombarded by US media, we get used to that.
I get that.
Yeah, and so on the whole, China has achieved a kind of a balance between these three powers in favor of the vast majority of the Chinese population. So that's why we have a common prosperity policy. And most people in China have become much better off than, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. If you compare, say, 40 years ago, the average income for Chinese household has increased 26 folds. Of course, the starting point was very low. Yeah. And then I remember I gave a talk just the other day. I said, look at the Chinese case. In the last 10 years, we spent roughly 250 billion US dollars, and we completed the last batch of poverty fighting. That is, close to 100 million people were out of poverty with this money, which means it was roughly 1/10 of what the United States spent on Afghan war, $2.3 trillion. Yeah, with this $2.3 trillion, by adopting the Chinese model of fighting poverty, in theory, we can wipe out global poverty, extreme poverty, including poverty in the United States. Yet, the United States prefer to spend this money on the war, on destruction, on violation of human rights. And you can lift already all the student loans for the American young people. So that's a problem between, you have the three powers in balance in favor of most people in China, and you have three powers in balance in favor of the minority. For the military industry, for Wall Street. That's my concern, you know. So with this in mind, you will see that when we read this issue of common prosperity, in other words, many, not only the government, the CPC, but also the ordinary people feel the excessive power of capital, like the tech giants, you know, this kind of monopoly, it's undermining, undercutting the interests of vast majority of the population. In other words, the problem monopoly. So they have to be in some way managed. Otherwise, there will be crisis. So I agree with what Charles had just said. You have to break monopoly, as many countries in the West also did in the past, even today. So this is part of this breaking up monopoly. At the same time, tech giants are still extremely dynamic in China today. Yeah. So this is the case. Thank you.
There is always, when you make a strategic policy decision, balance. You have to balance various interests and potential ramifications. Take the real estate sector. You talked about high cost of real estate in China. Well, basically Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. How do you address it? President Xi has been saying for several years now, houses are to live in, not to be speculated with. But many developers went on a binge of continuing extensive leveraging to expand their capital power. It's not that they've not been warned, they have been warned. And I think the government was planning on how to address this issue with the minimum amount of potential damage to the economy. So what the strategic policy mandate was is to improve long-term viability and sustainability of the real estate sector at the disadvantage of having short-term costs of forcing developers to deleverage. So it's a balance. So you actually have a situation in which the brokerage houses, the consultancies, the analysts, staring right in the face of potential policy changes in several sectors in China, but were not very attuned to changing their tune. They were not interested in doing something that is against their own interest. So I think in terms of sectors, there will be other sector changes, because e-commerce development in China, for example, and the internet economy, nobody could have anticipated or expected how fast it's grown. The use of WeChat Pay, Alipay, and so on, and now with RMB, digital RMB, no one could have foresaw how quickly and how big it got. Government is actually, in terms of policy support or policy implementation or formulation, is lagging behind a little bit.
If I could fast follow on the policy questions and policy ramifications, and this comes from the audience. One of the questions submitted to me is in the UK government's Treasury, senior policymaker in the Treasury, and one of her questions, and doesn't know as much about China or about the common prosperity policy as any of us wish we did, but as someone who makes policy around taxation in the UK, one of her questions was, why isn't the government in China trying to accomplish more of this policy objective through taxation? So she's aware of tax changes around the world, and tax reforms. I think in 2018 in China actually reduced personal income taxes for higher income earners. There are opportunities that aren't being taken from her perspective to tax real estate, to tax capital gains, to tax estates, and certainly in a democratic world context. These are common policies to shape the income and wealth distribution, whatever that society thinks is towards fairness. So do any of you have insight into why Beijing, why China is not pulling those policy levers, which, many of which there's decades of data demonstrating their effectiveness at accomplishing redistributions of wealth and income? Could you enlighten us on that question?
And Charles, would you like to say a few words on that?
I think I'm not an expert on fiscal policy and monetary policy.
Nor am I.
All I can say is taxation is one form, one tool in the hands of the government among many. One of the reasons why taxation had been lowered is because of the impact of the pandemic on small and medium-sized private enterprise. Many of them had lots of issues. The mom and pop restaurants, for example, and the small shops. And they needed to address an immediate issue, immediate problem. The other part about real estate tax, yes, it's being trialed, I think in Shanghai and in a few other places. And they're being very careful in terms of implementation because the impact on taxation on a national basis is going to differ depending on the location. Real estate tax in Shanghai and Beijing will be certainly very, very different in terms of impact on the population than Yunnan and Guizhou. So there is a balancing act that has to be made in terms of on a national basis to have national policy. But tax policy is one tool versus even bank reserve ratio, even other monetary tools. So I think there's a balancing that has to take place. And they're learning, as Deng Xiaoping said, crossing the river by feeling the stones in the river. Because what China is doing has never been done in human history. 1.4 billion people to have gone through what they have gone through. And it would take time. But the overall strategy, the key, is it's not individual based, it's societal based.
If I am allowed to say something. Thank you. Actually, as per my understanding, there was some crackdown on tax evasion by tech giants and also the e-commerce businessmen. They evaded tax, and their crackdown was related to that. What I understand, the disparity in China is more acute among the states. Like the eastern regions are more developed than the western part. So it will not be the similar like other countries, like only through taxation they can minimize the gap, the parity can be attained only through taxation. So there should be some more policy which can minimize the gap between the states. It's not only among the people, and also the government is taking action about those who are evading the taxation. This is what my understanding is. Thank you.
I just make a few brief comments on the issue of taxation. China is a very complex country. It's a continent, 1.4 billion people, and regions differ from each other. Just now, Charles mentioned, say, if there is this real estate tax, it will be perhaps differ from Shanghai to other regions because the prices are different, etc. And also, as China is developing so fast and so in such a dynamic way, all of a sudden, 90% of Chinese urban population have properties, and 100% in the rural areas. As a result, if you want to have a real estate tax, at what level? It's a lot of debate going on within China. In other words, before your tax policies are ready, it's already people become property class. So this is a challenge. Yet China has also certain advantages which Western countries don't have, because we still have a powerful, on the whole, profitable state-owned sector. By now, there is a government policy that state sector will contribute roughly 30% of their revenue to social affairs in China, including pension and medical insurance. So that's something extra. So what China is doing is they are having all kinds of pilot projects across the country, even concerning the real estate taxation. Shanghai is a pilot project, and Chongqing is another one. Yet, I also want to add that actually in China today, the indirect tax is quite high, but direct tax is not that high. That has to do with cultural traditions. People just feel, if it's indirect tax, they don't care much about it, But direct tax, something you rob me from now, that will be more a kind of problem. So all these are complicated issues facing China. Yet there is a general tendency in China today, I don't know how to put it, that is, we should try, as we have already experienced of other countries, including those in the West. So what we should try to do is to avoid the two extremes. One is what we call the Greek syndrome, excessive taxation, and then what we call the great lazy bones. And then you also have the American syndrome, which is too capitalistic. So we are really open to all kinds of experience, models from other countries. At the same time, we also try all kinds of pilot projects within China. It's a work in progress.
And I think so important for the world to learn from the experiences that China accumulates over the next, let's say, decade, 20 years of this common prosperity policy. I think one of the maybe relevant differences between the policy tools that China has available to it to build a more equitable society versus, say, in Canada or the United States or here in the UK, where there isn't a large state-owned sector, is that for a government that wants to affect social change, taxation sort of has to be the main lever, because we don't control industries that enable us to sort of change the behaviors that they take part in. And for various legal reasons and the strength of the capital system, it's very difficult to affect how property behaves, unless you can get your own money, and then you can do whatever you want with that if you are the government. And so it does seem that China has that extra lever to work with to try to figure out, okay, how can we use this to sort of transform income distributions in society? I guess my advice as a political scientist who has spent a lot of time studying the UK and the United States and their tax policies is that often the government doesn't get the resources it wants to push some of its more progressive policies, precisely because those who have the wealth don't want to be taxed for it. Those who own the real estate, own the capital, would prefer not for it to be taxed, or for it to be taxed before they pass it on to their children. And in democratic countries, that can present a very strong constituency against these sorts of prosperity policies. So does that constituency exist in China? My hypothesis is to some extent, and that's going to be a challenge for policymakers who want to move wealth around society. I only have one more question from the audience, and I think it's a good one to end on, which comes from a senior policy advisor in the Canadian Environment Ministry. And it's basically about climate change. And if you're working on climate change, for you, this is the only issue right now, and everything else is secondary, if you're working in that space, right? We had COP26 here in the United Kingdom last month. And so on behalf of the urgency of that agenda, would any of you like to offer a few words of, so what does common prosperity mean for tackling climate change?
Indeed, in this whole Paris Agreement, and even before that, there was a consensus in the international community that there should be a common and differentiated responsibility. In other words, it's a responsibility for all, yet the developed countries should have differentiated responsibility, because the West has contributed more to greenhouses during its industrial revolution, the accumulated greenhouses effect.
For China, this Paris Agreement has created an opportunity to minimize this income gap. How? China has adopted the policy of peaking the carbon by 2030 and reaching the carbon neutrality by 2060. China emits 30% of global carbon dioxide at this moment. So, a country like China reaching the carbon neutrality by 2060, it means that huge innovation of technology, and China is leading in green energy, solar, wind and hydropower in all these sectors. And also China has adopted just few months back the carbon trading system. As Professor Zhang Weiwei said, that the income disparity among the states in China is very high. So, those states which has more industries and which produce more carbon dioxide are more prosperous. So, emission trading means that those states which are producing more carbon will be taxed more, and this tax will be redistributed to the less carbon emitting states. That is how the inequality, the disparity among the states will be minimized. In another way, those states which are less developed like Xinjiang or other parts, they will produce more green energy. So, this Paris Agreement is a great opportunity, and I am confident that China will attain it. This income disparity, China will utilize this scope to minimize the gap among the states and improve the inequality. This is for China aspect. Let us go to the global aspect for the developing countries like Bangladesh. Chris, I will ask you, like, for every step of development, for every stone of development, you need energy, source of energy. Like every bricks need production of energy. So, how you create generate this energy? Like Bangladesh needs now 25,000 megawatt, we need 60,000 megawatt of electricity. And how we will generate this? If it costs $1 from fossil fuel and if it costs $3 from green sources, who will pay this $2? Who will pay this? And how can the countries like Bangladesh can be on board for common prosperity? How can the countries like Bangladesh? So, this is very fundamental question for development of the developing countries. There should be more justice, like the aviation industry and other industries which are producing more carbon dioxide has to minimize this gap of fossil fuel and the green energy for the countries like Bangladesh, which are not producing carbon dioxide at this moment. 0.47 ton per capita in Bangladesh, 7 ton per capita in China, 15 ton per capita in USA. So, why should be this much of difference of carbon dioxide production? We should be allowed to be like 10 tons per capita. We are not doing this, but still we are obliged to follow this, and we cannot develop. And this is not, there was no talk about this in Glasgow. There was no talk about this justice things in global forums. So, the developed countries, the people should know this more, that developing countries cannot develop in this way. We are most affected country, one of the most affected country, Bangladesh. We did not create this problem, and we are the most affected country. We don't emit carbon dioxide gas. So, we are not asking about the aid, we are asking the justice, and why should we pay more now? We are not polluting this carbon dioxide gas. So, the Green Climate Fund and New Development Bank all should come up how to find a way how to minimize this gap of electricity production for the countries like which are very much underdeveloped still now. Thank you.
I would just add two minor points. One, no one has the right to tell developing countries in Africa and the subcontinent, for example, that sorry, you're not getting any more electricity. No one has the right. It's human rights, basic human rights for them to be able to seek development and improvement of their lives. And it's absolutely critical that the developed countries have to take it more seriously. Look at what happened at the pandemic. There are developed countries which held on to vaccines until they expired instead of passing them on to African countries. With that type of attitude, the earth is over, it's finished. Second, carbon footprint. China emits a lot of carbon because it's a manufacturing center for the whole world. Should China be paying the carbon tax, or the consumers of these products be paying the carbon tax? Or there should be some sort of sharing. This is something that I think only to be fair, because Chinese production of household products, basic goods, shipped all over the world, are being consumed and therefore carbon emitted actually all over the world. So I think there are a lot of issues which have to be addressed in a fair and decent way. But the thing that makes me positive about this is the number of new startups that I've seen in hydrogen energy, in new materials, in 3D printing of solar panels, and so on, which potentially can be commercialized within the next 3 to 5 years, which could really, really make a difference. I just hope at that time the developed countries who own much of the patents will not be thinking about squeezing an extra buck out of it for the benefit of the world. Thank you.
Should I have some words from Chris in London, or anything to add?
All I would want to add is, on behalf of a global audience, thank you to each of you for taking some questions from around the world, and maybe just to reiterate my preface that from my perspective, it is so important that there are bold and giant and different experiments of how do we improve society going on around the world, and my personal hope is that we learn better how to learn from one another, to learn from these experiments, to move past a 20th century in which we had to treat one another as villains, because that was the game we were playing, and move better into a 21st century where we have to treat one another as colleagues, because that's the world that we are in. And my firm belief is that, I hope that you're clapping for the Thinkers Forum, because my firm belief is that it's initiatives like the Thinkers Forum that are going to help us get there if we can get there. And it's also the openness of you and the audience to engage in some really tough and interesting questions as we look at, okay, well, that was a big move, Beijing, common prosperity. Tell us more, and here are our doubts, and here are our questions. And if we can engage on that level, then we're going to do more learning together. And I think that's fundamentally sort of the way forward. So on the behalf of the audience, thanks very much. Professor Zhang, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Chris, for your remarks. Indeed, I share this remark 100%. That is, China and the West should learn from each other. And indeed, China has learned so much from the West. We're still learning, and we'll continue to learn whatever good is in the West. Personally, I think perhaps now the West should perhaps try to know a bit more about China and Chinese experience. And for instance, when we talk about common prosperity, and before that, eradicating extreme poverty, why China can do it so well? Because we regard fighting poverty as #1 human rights. And from my study of the European and American literature, fighting poverty on the whole is not part of human rights. Human rights is more about political civil rights. So China has really highlighted this issue to the level of human rights. And I think it has to do with the Chinese acceptance of the UN human rights regime, including civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. So fighting poverty should be treated as part of human rights. And today we regard common prosperity also as part of move towards better human rights. So this is perhaps some experience that China has accumulated and contributed to the international community, including the West, Indeed, 4 decades ago, if we talk about socialism, it almost meant common poverty. But today, because of the success of Chinese socialism, we can say we have already achieved prosperity, still with some inequality. But eventually, say 20 years, 15 years from now, we can basically achieve common prosperity. That would be a great contribution, not only to the Chinese people, but also to the international community. So with all these remarks, really, I thank you all. Thank you all the speakers, all the help from our friends and technicians for the successful convening of this first session of the Thinkers Forum. Thank you all. We hope to continue to have this in the future. Best regards to all of you. Thank you all. Bye.